right, cool. Okay, so we are up and live on YouTube. We're going to chat here. Charlie just asked me if we'll be running this live on YouTube. Yep, that's correct. The only downside there, of course, is that you can't interact as much in terms of asking questions, but if that's an easier way to access it, for sure. And so now we are live on YouTube. So good to see everybody. Welcome to our class. This is our third session together for our class on Rebels, Radicals, and Ranters, the unexpected story of Congregationalism. Let me say a quick brief prayer, and then we'll get started together. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the time that you give to us. We thank you for our fellowship and our community. We thank you for the history that has shaped and informed us. We pray, Lord, that you be with us now as we seek to learn more about the past and what it might have to say to the present as we look to the future. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, well, it is great to see everybody. I think we're going to have folks filtering in as we continue. So if you see me sort of pause a little bit, that's probably because I'm letting somebody in. So we are in, as I said, session 3 of our class, Rebels, Radicals, and Ranters. And just to remind us, this is basically kind of a history of the development of Congregationalism. And we're offering this class because we're in the process of thinking about our future. A new ministry team is in place. We're talking about possibilities of name change. And it's also good sometimes just to go back to your roots, to be reminded about the dynamics and the impulses that have shaped your tradition. And so that's one of the reasons why we decided to offer this class. So I am going to share my screen with you now. And we will start our slide show here. So I don't, unfortunately, because of the number of people that we have, I will not typically open up with a question like I did the very first time, but as many of you know who've been participating in this class and other classes, I really love the interaction. So if you have questions or comments, you can either, I'll pause at certain places, but you can also, if you decide, put something down in the chat. And when I have a moment to pause, I will take a look at that. So just for us to get a sense about where we are, just to remind us of what we talked about last week. So our first week, we really spent talking really about the background of what gives rise to Congregationalism, which is effectively the English Reformation. We talked about the ups and downs of that experience and the ways in which it arrived at what was trying to be what we might say a happy medium, which is the Elizabethan settlement. So this would be the settlement of how we're going to do church, how the church is going to relate to the state, and all of this is being constructed and built up under Elizabeth I. So that's our timetable. So we're late second half of the 16th century, effectively. And there are many folks who will become unsatisfied with that settlement. Some of them are unsatisfied about some of the theological issues that they feel haven't really been resolved in a more Protestant direction, which is what many of them would prefer. Others of them take objection to continuing practices that they think are too Catholic. Still others, the ones that we become interested in, are very concerned and object to the hierarchical structure that the Church of England is going to retain with an archbishop, bishops, etc. So this whole sort of superstructure that shapes the church, and then still others, we don't want to forget this, object to the kind of too close relationship between church and state. They tend to be a minority, but over time, I think we'll see that kind of the congregational impulse actually moves you in that direction. And I think this becomes clear or clarified when we get into the New England context and the experiment that's going on there and the kind of failures and challenges of that. Let's see here, we got a couple people wanting to come in here. All right, so that was our first class. Last week, then, I introduced you basically to 3 key proponents of Congregationalist type ideas. The first figure, really, we can't describe this person as a Congregationalist, And this is Thomas Cartwright, but I wanted to talk about him because he really is one of the most important of the early Puritans, right? So congregationalism, in a sense, comes out of Puritanism, and as we described Puritanism, it's a pretty big tent with a lot of different competing factions within that tradition. And Cartwright is probably he's not we can't say he's the guy, but he's certainly one of the most important of the early articulators. And he works out his position in the 1570s and 1580s in a series of pamphlet debates, as well as some lectures that he gives. For a brief stint, he's a professor at Cambridge. And what we could describe is we could say that he's basically a mixture of Presbyterianism and Congregationalism. And that's why I have this term here, Presbygationalism. And I partly use this because it's actually going to come back later on when we talk about what's happening in North America in the 19th century. So this will come back again, which means, yes, this will be on the exam, right? I mean, there's no way to avoid that. So what is it that Cartwright does? The most important thing that he does is he argues against a hierarchical structure. He wants to have more control by local churches. They should be the ones who have control to choose their ministers, to choose their elders, to dispense their funds, to oversee church discipline, i.e. to perform excommunication if necessary. At the same time, Cartwright is still, we might say, a more conservative impulse or aristocratic impulse. He doesn't believe that all of the power should be in the hands of the laity all of the time, right? The laity should have, and by laity, by the way, we want to make sure that we're clear, and we said this last week, we're talking principally at this point about men, and oftentimes about men from a certain social class. Now, while Puritans are in the English context, particularly during this period, class issues, there's more of a leveling process. There are other places and times in which class does come much more to the fore, and that I think is probably the case in the New England context. But at least here, we're saying something like, we're still giving more power to more people than normally have it, even though clearly women have been excluded. So Cartwright believes that the local congregation, in the form of the men in the congregation, and more than likely those who have some sort of landed property perhaps, they should be the ones who are allowed to vote, to pick elders, etc. And then, but once those elders are put in place, the rest of the congregation should obey their decisions. All right, so this is the Presbyterian component of obeying the elders, but also that each congregation should not be allowed to kind of do whatever it wants. It needs to be held accountable by other congregations, and this is the Presbyterian synod structure. All right, so he wants to have still some oversight, some level of ministerial oversight, but he doesn't want to have bishops, he doesn't want to have archbishops, etc. But this idea, right, of giving local congregations significant control, this is why he should be part of our story, because this obviously is a key component of Congregationalism. We then went and turned and talked really about our first sort of bona fide Congregationalist, a man named Robert Brown, and the subsequent position that became associated with his name of Brownism. And as I mentioned, this position is attacked by Catholics, by Anglicans, and by Presbyterians. They all find it objectionable. But as it turns out, this really is going to become the position that winds up shaping our history. So what does Brown argue for? He argues for the full autonomy of the local congregation. That is, the people in a locale are those who are called together and gathered by God. They make a covenant, or God, in that gathering, God has made a covenant with them.
Was it fun?
They make a covenant with one another. And they then have the power to make all of the decisions regarding who's going to be our minister, who's going to be our elder, how are we going to do discipline, how are we going to care for the poor, etc. And Brown very much would probably, we could say, move a couple of steps away then from the Presbyterian approach, in the sense that the congregation has ongoing power, and there's a kind of negotiation, I would say, that happens between minister and congregation, in which the ministers and or the elders just become one more vote. They don't wind up necessarily having significant power. They can have advising power, but they don't necessarily have like, you're going to do what we say because you put us in charge kind of thing. The third thing that I included there, and I think is very important and one that has been important in the history of our own church, is a sense in Brown of the necessity to be attuned to the spirit, right? The power of discernment. And this comes through, I think, particularly clearly when he talks about the process for ordination of elders, right? To become an elder, the person has to feel a call, but then the congregation goes through a significant period, several days of fasting and prayer to discern whether or not they also believe that God has made that call. So this idea of discerning the spirit, of being attuned to the spirit and the living presence of God and in the present, this is also very important and will play a role as congregationalism, I think, moves forward as well. One of the reasons why Brown becomes particularly odious, his name, is because in a world shaped by monarchy and aristocracy, he also argues for democracy in terms of civil governance. Now, like many of the figures that we will encounter in our story, eventually Brown pulls away from these positions. He actually recants some of these positions, and at the end of his life, he's actually an Anglican priest. Nevertheless, his ideas live on. People pick up his ideas and take them forward because he writes a lot of texts, and those things make circulation. And so once those ideas become unconnected from him, they can have a life of their own. The key figure in that regard that we talked about last week was Henry Barrow. Barrow effectively follows Brown. He pretty much would be an advocate for something like Brownism, but he kind of mixes in the idea that once the decision is made regarding who is going to be in charge in the context of the church, like who's going to be the elder, who's going to be the minister, he wants to have a little bit more of a sense of obedience and submission on behalf of the congregation, right? So we might describe this as a little bit more conservative. And one of the things I pointed out last time is that Brownism and what comes to be called Barrowism become significant tensions in our tradition. And this all kind of boils back to one of the major questions that I raised at the very beginning of this class, which is one of the dynamics in congregationalism is, where does power reside and how do we negotiate it? How do we make decisions together? Does power reside in the office of the ministers in regards to who the church is going to be? Or is there some more careful conversation that happens between ministers and congregation, et cetera? And so you can kind of see that this is something that's being sort of figured out as the tradition moves forward. Okay, so that's from last week. So let me kind of turn us and move us forward. We're going to now begin shifting our story pretty much out of England, out of the English context, into the context of exile, and then eventually New England. I will do, I think probably in a couple weeks or at least one more week, I'll kind of glance back at some things that are happening in England, but we're going to go to Holland and then we're going to migrate over to North America, and much of our story is going to kind of develop in that regard. All right, so that's kind of where we're going. So if you remember, Elizabeth comes to the throne in the 1550s, 1560s. The settlement is happening, 1570s and 80s. We have a kind of a finally an expression in some sense of Puritan values. Debate is happening. There are, and it's not clear, by the way, that all of the bishops would agree with the archbishop. In fact, that's actually unclear. There's significant numbers of bishops that oftentimes were positively inclined towards Puritan ministers. They didn't always necessarily agree with everything that those ministers advocated, but they found those ministers to be very effective in their calling. So fast forwarding it, now we get up into the 1590s, and we're going to add sort of one more wrinkle before we get over to North America. And basically in the 1590s, during that period, Elizabeth and her archbishop have managed to suppress most of the Puritan factions. What I mean by that is debate has pretty much been shut down. And if you're going to start, if you're going to write something, typically you're probably going to have to write it anonymously, and you're going to have to hope that you don't get found out for what you have written. What this does is it actually unleashes a new process or situation, we might describe here, that creates another, it's difficult to precisely pin it down, but another way of thinking about how are we going to relate to the larger Church of England, and what is that going to mean? And what we're going to talk about here is what comes to be called non-separatist Puritanism. So the figures that we talked about before, particularly Brown and Barrow, they are separatists. Their belief is that the Church of England is no longer truly a church. It is too mixed in with error. It's too mixed in with idolatry, and even the people who would be included in the church, and they place such a high premium on the membership of the church. Like, if you're going to give the church members that much power, then we want to make sure that they're actually truly called. And we talked about the problems that come up with that. So, but they felt that that's clearly not the case in the Church of England, where pretty much anybody who's born in a certain area can go to church. So this is a time when having your doors wide open is not the orientation, at least for the Puritans. They want to make it much more difficult. So what do? Right? So this is the situation then that gets unleashed, and it goes on pretty much, I would say, up into 1640. But it starts with Elizabeth, goes through the time of James I, and then we'll move into the time of Charles I that we'll talk a little bit about later. So what's that process? Well, the first thing is it turns almost all Puritans who choose not to give up their convictions, but also choose not to leave the Church of England, into a category called nonconformist. So they all become nonconformists and or dissenters because they refuse to conform to the prescriptions laid out in the English Book of Common Prayer and the various guidelines for how worship should be structured, what kinds of practices should be allowed, what types of vestments should be worn, etc. They basically object to this, and because they do so, they are called nonconformists or dissenters, and they have to sort of live an interesting life. So if you're you could be this first category of nonconformist, and you're probably primarily trying to evade arrest in one form or another. The second category is what we might call conformist Puritans. These are Puritans who still have their Puritan convictions around issues about worship, issues of theology, issues around how we should celebrate the Lord's Supper and whatnot, but they have either by accident or by temperament, they have found some bishops in certain areas who are willing to work with them, right? Who are willing to say, okay, I know that you have these nonconformist sympathies, but you're a good preacher and you have a pastoral heart and you're an effective minister, and that's what I need right now. I don't have enough effective ministers in this area, so I'm going to work with you. And so we see there are interesting examples of this. I think one of the most prominent ones for our story is a man named John Cotton. And Cotton is going to become a leading figure in the Massachusetts Bay Colony later on, because eventually he cannot exist in the situation. But initially he holds several different positions, even though he has these Puritan Congregationalist sympathies. Nevertheless, there are certain bishops that are interested in working with him. So you have some who are nonconformists who are pretty much trying to evade arrest, etc. You have others who are conformists. They're willing to do the work and engage in it. And then finally, you have the third category, the one that we've talked about before, which are the separatists, who generally have to flee or go underground. Eventually, even some of the first group are going to wind up fleeing and going into exile. So these are sort of three areas, and they wind up being produced because of the monarchy's orientation towards this group of folks. So the first of these, I'm going to pause in just a moment, but the first of these groups that we want to talk a little bit about as we begin to kind of transition over to Holland is what's known as the London Amsterdam Church. And so this is a church that eventually makes its way, winds up in a sense, in Holland by 1595. Apparently, this church is founded more than likely in the 1580s, 1587, I think, because it's associated with Barrow, whom we've already talked about. It may have started in the town of Norwich. And there's another church that we talked about that started in Norwich, and that was the church that Robert Brown had founded. So that area seems to have been a hotbed for these kinds of developments. They make their way into London. They wind up being discovered in the late 1580s. Many of them are rounded up by 1593. All of the leaders are rounded up, as well as around 50 to 60 of the congregational members, and they're arrested and put into prison. Eventually, a lot of these congregation members are released, but Barrow and Greenwood, who were the leaders, they wind up being executed in 1593 because of their position. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that Barrow expresses his thoughts while he's in prison. So he winds up writing down a lot of what he thinks, and that's why his ideas are going to continue to move forward. By about 1595 or so, this group has then resettled itself. It's immigrated to Amsterdam, and they produce what is considered kind of one of the earliest congregational confessions in 1596. So one of our first confessional statements in our tradition comes from this period in this group, and it probably represents the thought of Barrow. Obviously, Barrow is dead. But the kind of the scholarship seems to argue at this point, at least, that the ideas contained in that document, which includes both a kind of affirmation about what do we believe about God and Scripture, but it also talks about what do we think about the church, right? And that seems to be, of course, very important, certainly for our story. All right, let me pause here and see what kinds of comments or questions we have. First, I have a all right, so the first question I have, which is really good, is from Vivian McEwen, and this is in the chat. She says, so imprisonment and executions took place because of their religious beliefs or because those beliefs were considered seditious? I would say both, right? It's if you choose not to conform, this is not just a matter of religion, it's also a matter of state, because the queen, right, is the head of the church. And there is a prevailing conviction for Elizabeth, for James, and for Charles that a strong monarchy is associated with and accompanied by a strong episcopacy. And episcopacy is simply that word for archbishops and bishops, etc. So if you're taking exception to the episcopacy, right, by connection, you're kind of taking issue, at least from their perspective, to the absolute supremacy of the monarchy. Great question. All right, other questions?
You know, I'm just struck by how long this kind of thing has happened. I mean, I think about going back to the time of the Crusades, how much violence and death has been visited upon people because of their faith or someone's perceived lack of faith or proper thinking, and how screwed up we all continue to be, right? Just my observation.
Well, and I appreciate that because, and I do think it's, it's a posit here, because when we get into New England, some of the early Congregationalists are going to do the exact same thing. And so they have to learn some hard lessons regarding this question. Like they themselves are seeking religious toleration and freedom, and they wind up replicating that, at least for a portion of the first generation in New England. So it's gonna, thank you.
Christian,
other comments? Yeah.
I've got a kind of a meta question rather than specific content, and that's with this kind of study that we're going through, one of the very important lessons we learn is humility on our faith, not being overconfident. But the struggle then is balancing humility with total lack of confidence. How do you have commitment or zeal for whatever you happen to believe if you understand how easy it would be for you to be wrong?
Yeah, that's a great. That's a great question. And there are different ways of, if I could put it historically, like if we won't go back into this time period, um, there are very few people who are willing to embrace that they might not know certain things that are essential. And I'm not saying that they are not there, but questions around what is the truth, because of the belief that that is so tightly bound with the social order, as opposed to the way we talk about these things, where we don't we sort of live or take for granted a context which assumes something like separation of church and state. In those days, that was not the case, right? And so if public order, is up for grabs, depending on how we're going to navigate and negotiate a question about religious truth, it's going to be harder, I think, to find people. You will find some. And actually, there are a couple of really interesting examples that we'll talk about probably next week, who are Congregationalists, and they're participating in the Westminster Assembly. And I'm just going to bring them in as a very brief episode, but they show a kind of humility that things will change, that it's entirely possible, that we ought not therefore to bind ourselves to what we're going to do now in perpetuity, because things change and they evolve. And so we'll hear a little bit about that. So, but I think the question you're raising is it's a meta question. The way that I have wound up working it out for myself is just probably through being involved in ecumenical, and interfaith kinds of conversations, where you really do need to have a sense of what are your commitments and convictions, and what do you therefore bring to the table, but also knowing that that there are parts of that where you could be wrong, or at the very least you could learn something from someone else. And so I think, yeah, it just feels like it's kind of a journey, perhaps. I don't know, but that's a great question. You are not known for asking small questions, so just typical of you. All right. Any others before I move us forward? Okay. All right. Well, let's do a little bit more on the Dutch exiles. We have a couple more folks that we want to bring into the story, and we're kind of following here. The narrative that we're trying to follow is not to be totally comprehensive, but to sort of move us into the kind of American context that eventually we want to find ourselves in, as we're trying to understand our own kind of story. So the second group, which is really made up of two different communities, but they tend to be linked together because the two towns were so close together. But this is the church in the small village of Gainsborough, and another church in the small village of Scrooby. And the Gainsborough community is actually important for my tradition, at least like the tradition that I am ordained in, which is the American Baptist tradition, because it is led by John Smith, who is considered one of the earliest Baptists eventually. And eventually this group comes under the sway, as I'll show you in just a moment, of another key Baptist figure. The other group, though, is important because we start to hear names that maybe we're familiar with, like John Robinson, right? So the Scrooby community is one that is established pretty early on. I think it's like 1602, 1604. I don't have the dates here for you. But not long into its existence, John Robinson winds up joining this group in 1606. These groups decide on this. We've now, by the way, left the time of Elizabeth I, and we've entered into the time of James I. And so they are experiencing the continued repression, essentially, of anything connected to Puritanism, whether you're Presbyterian, Congregational, Leveler, or whatever. As you remember, I gave you an array of positions. So they wind up deciding that they also need to together make their way to Holland. This happens in 1608. So the first group, which is, we're going to kind of end our story with them here, but the group led by Smith, they wind up in Amsterdam, and they actually get into a debate. Smith gets into a debate with the other community, the one that we just talked about, the London community. And through the process of that debate, he becomes more and more radical in his separatism. And eventually he is going to wind up leaving the community to join the Mennonites because of the pacifism, because of the refusal to take an oath to the state, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, adult baptism is going to be significant for him. That community then will eventually kind of, in some ways, it will leave sort of the line of our story, but it retains a congregational polity. And as they become kind of one of the first Baptist congregations, and Thomas Helways is the figure who winds up taking over the community, and they actually migrate back. Helways at least migrates back, and he's arrested and executed in 1616. And Helways is really the first person, one of the first certainly, to argue for something like religious toleration, right? So to argue that the state ought not to be involved in compelling and enforcing religious uniformity, that should be up to the conscience of the individual. The Scrooby group, which is the one that we're going to kind of follow, because they basically become the Pilgrims, right? They wind up coming over. They settle in Amsterdam initially in 1608, but then they decide to make their way to Leiden in 1609. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe they're watching these debates happen and they just don't like it, or if they just decide that Leiden is a better space for them. They make their way over to Leiden, and it appears, at least in some of the sort of the scholarship that I was reading, that Robinson, who was definitely a committed separatist, he begins to moderate a little bit more. So he kind of softens some of his separatism. And one of the most important elements of that is that he begins to acknowledge that there may be other ways of doing church that are legitimate, that are not necessarily separatist. And that's important, right? So here we come back to that question you raised, Ross, which is having some sense of humility and recognizing that you might change your mind a little bit over time. So Robinson winds up getting involved in carrying on a correspondence with a couple of figures I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And he comes to the conviction that, well, maybe to be a legit, so he's going to say, to be a legit church, you still need to be congregational, but maybe you don't have to cut all your ties to the Church of England, right? Maybe there can be some way for rapprochement with the Church of England. And that, as I say, there is the second one. Eventually he allows for a modest recognition of this. Now, this is important because remember, Robinson's group, and Robinson himself does not go with this group over to Plymouth, but he kind of sends them on their way. He gives them sort of a blessing. And eventually when they make their way over to New England, that group is down the road is going to mix in and meld together with the larger Massachusetts Bay folks, and they're all non-separatist Congregationalists. So in some sense, like the tenor here is being set up for this. Okay, so these groups are effectively still separatist groups. That's their orientation. Now we want to bring in the non-separatist groups that will wind up being somewhat important as we turn and talk about New England. And here, I'm not going to get into a significant kind of too much description of sort of their theological or ecclesiological kinds of elements. The key difference here is just that this is a group, or these are groups that felt that they should and could pursue their vision, congregational vision, more or less like Henry Barrow which is kind of modified Brown. But they could do it in the context of the Church of England with the hope that they might convert the Church of England into this model. That's kind of their vision, right? So they don't want to leave because they don't think that the church is totally bereft. They actually want to work for change within. And I'll talk briefly about how they think about that. So the two key figures here are Henry Jacob, and his orientation is more in the Brownist direction, which is the radical democracy in the congregation. And then William Ames, which is a little bit less, it's more kind of maybe Republican or representational in that sense. And Ames becomes important because he's really the most significant early scholar, and he will write a set number of theological treatises that function like textbooks, basically, in New England, the most important of which is the Marrow of Sacred Divinity. All right. So they arrive right around the same time in Holland. They represent the non-separatist impulse. They're coming over 1606 for Henry Jacob, 1610 for William Ames. And their basic belief, and this I found this fascinating because this is basically pietism. And I've written a book, edited a couple books and several articles on pietism, and so it's always interesting to see some of the earlier roots of these ideas. They believed that they could establish basically communities or churches within the larger church. So that's their vision. They want to set up congregations that function according to the congregational vision, where the laity have control, where the laity are making decisions, but they still want to do it somehow within the confines of connection to the larger English church, with the hope that they will be like leaven, right? So the idea is to be a leavening presence that will eventually transform the whole of the church. Pietism, and let me kind of use this as a kind of an additional like anecdote maybe that can help. The pietists believe, let's create small groups within the larger church, and those small groups of committed individuals will then be a leavening presence to renew the larger church. Right? So that's kind of the vision that these folks are working with. Exactly how they thought that was going to unfold is not entirely clear to me, because you'd still have a superstructure. Were they going to keep that? I don't know. But all right, so the place where this gets articulated most clearly is in William Ames's work, Marrow of Sacred Divinity. And this is written and published in 1639. And as I said, this becomes a textbook for many over in New England. So as they're thinking about theology and church and all that kind of stuff, they're reading this text. And the argument in that book is that the only universal church, and this is where they're pushing back. So they're kind of pushing back on something that's being articulated at them by English authorities, which is the reason that we need to have a national church is because the church is supposed to be universal. It's supposed to connect with and to everybody. And so it should be open to everybody and everybody should be included in it. Well, these guys obviously are not committed to that. They believe that the only people that should be included in the church are the people who've been genuinely called, all right? And we've talked about how that's problematic, but this is certainly part of the early part of our history. Their argument in kind of against that is that, yes, there is a universal church, but that is the invisible church, right? That is the mystical or invisible body of Christ. And the only place that the mystical body of Christ comes into view is in the local congregation, right? So the local congregation is the primary place where the church is, the essence of the church in some sense is embodied in history. It's not embodied in history through a massive hierarchical superstructure of bishops and archbishops, etc. So that's the kind of their basic argument for how they understand their own existence in the church, why they want to stay in the church. And then, as I mentioned before, they believe in some sense that if they remain there, they will have the ability potentially to transform the English church. Let's see, I've got a comment here. I'm going to, just for 1 second, let me make one last comment before I answer this chat question. and this is just sort of to round things up, to note that Henry Jacob will eventually return from Holland in 1619, and he will establish the first continuous congregational church on English soil, and it's located in South London. So if we talk about, the oldest congregational church, ongoing congregationalist church, it is the one founded by Henry Jacob, located in South London. All right, let me stop there because we're now kind of at the end of our comments about the Dutch exiles and see what kinds of questions you might have. So the first one is from Vivian. Were these changes or movements driven by people in a specific socioeconomic group? I'm wondering how education played a role in the desire for laity to drive the bus. I'm thinking the majority of the people were at this point uneducated peasantry. That's a good question. Well, I could throw a couple of disconnected things out there into the hopper to engage this. One is the fact that one of the central places where we see a lot of Puritan activity is in places like Oxford and Cambridge. So these are ideas that are not only coming from the edges. They're coming from places of significant power, at least in terms of educational power. And of course, we also want to keep in mind that within 6 years of the Massachusetts Bay Colony establishing itself, they found Harvard College. So there's a deep, deep commitment to education that runs through this whole movement. I mean, the first people to advocate for public schools in the Americas, Congregationalists, right? So they have a really deep sense of value. So education, very, very important. Now, the actual demography of who are in these communities, I cannot say. I just don't know. I think it's a great question. It's clear that a lot of the leaders that I've talked about are people who have received some form of a university education, which probably means they come out of a more wealthy or a family of means kind of situation. But that's a great question. I will say that the threat of the ideas are that they become associated with the quote rabble, right? So the reason that the authorities attack Robert Brown's ideas is because of the fear that you're going to give power to the peasantry, right? You're going to give power to people, to average people, and I think that's an interesting component of our own tradition of empowering people, whatever their educational background is, to have a voice in the life of the church. All right, so we have a comment here. Yeah, Episcopal. So the Episcopal Church is the American version of the Church of England. That's why they have. That's why they have that similarity, Terry. That's a good comment there. And John Holden is talking about monergism. John, I can't believe you asked that question. You must have been doing some additional reading. I mean, basically, I think monergism, it depends on the context, but you're probably asking it within this context, which tends to refer to when someone is brought to God, into a relationship with God, what role does the human play, and what role does the divine play? And monergism argues that it is only the divine that plays a role. There's a mono energy, a single energy that creates the relationship. Synergism, right, is that both play a role. So monergism, and that is the more dominant approach to this question, certainly in my early Puritans. All right, any other comments or questions? All right, so let's make our way across the Atlantic, and much like our story regarding migration to Holland started out with the the separatist story and then the non-separatist story. It's going to be the same thing for the New England story. Separatists are the first ones who go, and then later they are followed by the non-separatists. So the group that we've already talked about, the Scrooby group, right, which was connected to John Robinson, which eventually settles in Leiden, they become basically the Pilgrims. By around 1617, they have decided to immigrate to New England. I was, in terms of the scholarship I was able to read, it sounds like there might be a mixture of factors for why that happened. Part of it is they want to live somewhere under English law. They can't do that in Holland. Part of it may be economic duress. Part of it may be the potential of a war at that time between Holland and Spain. They didn't want to get caught up in that, etc. Part of it may also have been that they wanted to get out of Holland because they would be even further away from the crown being able to kind of mess with them. So Holland's really not that far away from England. So it sounds like there's a whole mixture, but by 1617, they have decided it's time to make this move. And they're in a bit of a pickle because, obviously if you're a separatist in a certain sense, you take exception to the role of the crown in the affairs of religion. But at the time, the way that migration to New England was developing was under the pretense that the King of England had some sort of authority to grant you a land grant. Now, of course, I don't need to point out to you the fact that this is problematic, given the fact that there are indigenous peoples here, and I'll make that point in just a moment. But even before we get to that, that means that the separatists are going to have to petition the king to get a charter from the Virginia Company so that they can make their way to over to North America. Now, originally they planned to go to Virginia, and they get knocked off course and they wound up in New England. In that petition, they actually make a few serious concessions, right? And so they acknowledge royal supremacy, and they acknowledge episcopacy, right? Which is something that separatists don't do. So the sincerity, I suppose, of this we might question, but they basically dance the dance that they need to dance to get the ticket that they want to get, and so that is what happens. They secure that charter in 1620, and that's why we started out back in September with a sermon from Jeff on the Plymouth colony and the Pilgrims coming over, and they actually wind up landing sometime in November. So they're intending to sail to Virginia. Again, these charters, and it's not just English, it's Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, all of them basically argue that legitimate ownership of the land by native peoples is impossible because they're not Christians. And we can have a conversation about that later on, but one of the reasons why I also want to highlight this is that this is actually going to become a part of our story in just a little bit. When they leave, we know there's this famous sermon, farewell sermon, that Robinson gives, and we don't have the actual sermon, but we have the notes taken by someone who's present. And he says that Robinson said, "If God should reveal anything to us by any other instrument of his, we should be ready to receive it, as ever we were to receive any truth by his ministry. For he was confident that the Lord had more truth and light to break forth out of his holy word." I'm sorry, it should be about an hour. And the idea then is to be, again, expectant for the work of the Spirit in the life of the community as it tries to make its way in the world. So the group from Leiden makes its way over to England, and it's in England that they board the ship, the Mayflower, in 1620. The ship carries 101 passengers. 41 of those passengers come from the Leiden group. Maybe there's a couple additional folks there that they recruit in England. But so one thing that I like to point out here is that means then that not everybody on this ship is a Puritan. Not everybody on this ship intends to go over to North America with whatever the Puritan motivations are, right? It's already at the very beginning a mixed company. Now, as the ship gets knocked off course and they get somewhat closer to the Cape Cod area, there is significant unrest that erupts because some on the ship, and there are different kinds of motivations for this, but some on the ship argue that they are no longer obligated to live according to the agreement that they made because they are not landing in Virginia, right? So if I'm not landing in the place where I was supposed to land, which is the place where I was supposed to work out my agreement, then landing here, I'm not required to do that. So the Puritan group responds by creating a compact. They call it the Mayflower Compact, which I'm sure you've heard about in grade school all the way on up. And this is effectively is a covenanted form of governance in which the parties agree to cooperate with one another and to obey the common laws that they pass so that they will all survive. So one of the reasons why this is important is because it represents an early expression of the consent of the governed, right? So everyone, the power resides with the people themselves bring their power together and they give it to this compact. And the compact itself is very, very short. It doesn't really represent the later laws that are going to come upon. It's just an agreement to abide by those laws. See, I'm getting a comment here. So Tom, the native people could not have a say because they were not Christians. Would they also argue that other Europeans could not honor their charters because they were not the right kind of Christian? No. That's a great question, Tom, and it shows you that we're not quite into a racialized version of this, but it shows, but we are getting closer to that because at least in many of the English charters, it's you have a right to this land as long as it's not under the domination of another Christian king, and that other Christian king then could be a Spanish or Portuguese or whatever. So these charters these are, by the way, these are the first form of international law developed. And of course, it's international law being developed so that Europeans can get along with each other while they take possession of the land, right? And so you can hear the problematics of that in terms of that, why that story works itself out later on. All right, so the colony is established. The first couple of years, major hardships, something like, I think the death rate is like 60, 70%. There's a trickle of migration into Plymouth. And one important thing to note is that even though this community does have a very strong religious component to it, though we've already noted that over half are not necessarily Puritan, or of the Leiden Puritan version. Nevertheless, they don't have a duly ordained clergy person. They have someone who can preach, but they don't have someone who can give the sacraments, and that's not the case until the 1630s. All right. The last thing I want to do is we're not going to be able to get into all of the details of the vision of the first generation, but I do want to complete the story of coming over by now talking here about the second migration, which is kind of the one that comes to be the story of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the first thing is in 1625, Charles I is going to come to the throne, and he's going to intensify basically the campaign of James I and the Archbishop, who from the Puritan perspective is the infamous Archbishop Laud. They're going to intensify their persecution of Puritans in England. And so people, for instance, who were Puritan in conviction, but had figured out how to work out a relationship with a local bishop, and maybe they would do some things that they didn't necessarily agree with, but then they would also be allowed to not do other things that they didn't agree with. All those kinds of arrangements begin to come to an end because the screws begin to tighten. And this then gives the impetus for a number of Puritans to consider immigration, right? And that certainly is the case with the figure we mentioned earlier, John Cotton, who's really one of the great early leaders. At the same time, the Virginia Company has a lot at stake, as does the Crown, because the Crown is wrapped up in the Virginia Company, and so they are producing, publications to talk about why you should come over to the colony, right? What's the benefits? How successful are things? So people are feeling the pressure in England, and they're reading about things that are happening over in New England, and they're like, okay, maybe we should consider going. And so that's a part of the if we think about it sort of from a sociological perspective. The first settlement that's sort of not connected then to Plymouth is in 1628, and this is in Salem. So the Salem colony is the first one to be established, and it's also, of course, a non-separatist. So all the figures that we're going to talk about here in the 1630s are non-separatists, and they come over in massive droves, and they quickly dwarf what's happening down in Plymouth. One of the reasons why I also wanted to highlight this is that this is actually the text of covenant that we use in our church. So if you join our church and you become a member, you memorize this statement from 1629, the Salem Covenant, and this comes then from this community. And it reads, "We covenant with the Lord and with one another, and do bind ourselves in the presence of God to walk together in all his ways, according as he is pleased to reveal himself to us in his blessed word of truth." All right, so that's in 1628, but the really big period of migration happens from 1630 to 1642. And somewhere around 20,000 Puritans begin to flood in to New England, to the Massachusetts Bay Area, establishing colonies. And then some of them, even in that period, in that decade, a few of them will go down to Connecticut as well. And then you will wind up also with some New Hampshire things happening also around that time. So 20,000 Puritan migrants move in. Among them are the significant names, and I'm not going to go into all the histories of all these, but some of these we will talk a little bit more in detail. So John Winthrop, he is the first governor of the colony. He is the one who sort of preaches the sermon that talks about we're going to set up a city on a hill. Roger Williams is a major figure who winds up being exiled from the colony. We'll talk about him. John Cotton, Thomas Hooker, two of the leading sort of intellectual forces in the colony. Anne Hutchinson, also someone who winds up experiencing exile, but is very important in the work and role that she plays. Richard Mather and Mary Dyer. Mary Dyer actually is a follower of Anne Hutchinson, and she eventually becomes a Quaker and also winds up being executed by the authorities. And then John Davenport, who is very important because of the work that he winds up doing, setting up a colony in Connecticut. So, and all of this, we're going to try to get into some of the detail of this down the road, but not get too drowned out. But these are sort of key figures and key names that will show up from time to time. Around 1640 or so, the migration begins to slow to a trickle, and the reason for this is that there's been a revolution in England in which there's a civil war going on, and that civil war over the course of about 7 or 8 years is going to wind up with the execution of the king. Charles I is going to wind up being beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell is going to be put in charge, and Presbyterianism and Congregationalism are going to become sort of ascendant powers, at least briefly. But how this affects people in New England is it slows down migration. So you can have 20,000 migrants come over, by the way, and at any point in time, we could look at the population and find out that 30-40% of these people have died, right? So early migration comes with a human cost. However, over time, over about 20-year period, it turns out that the birth rate in New England is much higher. People seem to be much healthier. The water is cleaner. The diet, including corn, turns out to have much better nutritional value, et cetera. So there are a lot of health benefits, but initially, at least, even though 20,000 people come over here, many of them can die within a year or two. And as I say here, after 1640 and then another event, the colony is actually going to vote to have slavery, which will be a significant problem as we move forward. All right. So let me stop there. I know I've got at least one comment or question. So the question of Terry here, the Spanish colonials settled cities like Santa Fe, preceded the Pilgrims, yes. Catholic missions, were they ever interested, accepted? No, not at all. This is a period of virulent anti-Catholicism among Protestants. And so they actually would have viewed the Catholic presence on the continent as very, very like demonic. They would have used that kind of language. So yeah.
Christian, wasn't Maryland set up by the Catholics as well, though?
Yes. Yeah, but it's still viewed with great suspicion in New England. Absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Christian, I thought there was a sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I
Aaron.
thought there was a distinction between Pilgrims and Puritan factions, but it's sounding like they were all kind of Puritans. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would
Was
use
there
the
a
word.
difference?
I would use the word Puritan as a big umbrella tent term that would include numerous factions. Like you could be Presbyterian, you could be Congregational, you might have a more radical economic critique, like the Levelers and the Diggers. You might be someone who is open to the possibility that you could go around preaching in the nude, which is one group was into that. And but that word Puritan, it became a massive grab bag in the English context. In the context of New England, Puritan does, I think, function in some sense as distinct from Pilgrim, but the distinction is just that the Puritan ones that we're talking about are non-separatists and the Pilgrim ones are the separatists. And so if we think, I mean, Pilgrim to me is like, it's more of a colloquial. If we want to have a more precise term, we would say separatist and non-separatist Puritan.
Could Pilgrim even be more general, just like traveler?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not even sure where that, it would be interesting actually to know where that descriptor came from. Like what's the history of that?
Well, there's
something that they
scriptural of
No, I know that,
know,
but I mean,
yeah,
when does it arise? Why? Who is it that's
Yeah.
using it? Is it part of the mythology? Was it actually used by the people who come over? Those would be the kind of questions. Okay, so we have another question here by Pat. Talk more about other non-Puritans that came on the Mayflower. Well, I don't know enough. I can say for sure that, so part of this comes back to the way it's related to a bigger question of why do we tell the story of the U.S. the way that we tell it? So if you remember the way that you heard the story of how the U.S. was formed, typically you talked about New England and the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. But the reality, of course, is that the Virginia colonies exist before that. So why do we tell the story from the perspective of New England instead of Virginia? And I think if you drill down, you find out that one of the main reasons is that the Virginia colony makes no pretense about why it's doing what it's doing. It's doing it for economic gain. It's about money. It's about land, etc. That's the primary reason that they're doing what they're doing. Whereas the Pilgrim story clearly has a religious component in that, obviously. But if you actually look at the like all the people that are on the Mayflower, you have a more mixed company. You certainly are going to have people who are religiously committed, But then you're probably also going to have people who are more like the folks that are already down in the Virginia colony, right? Folks who are privateers or entrepreneurs or however, whatever the language we want to use, who may or may not have altogether good motives. You're going to have a bunch of second sons. That's another group that were attracted to this. That is people who could not inherit land in England because they were a second son. And so when we tell the story of America, oftentimes, at least in the young, like when we're younger, it sounds a lot better to say that the thing that led people here was a feeling of like wanting religious freedom than like we wanted money. And I think that's one of the reasons why we tell the story that way. But if we actually look at it, we see that it is more complicated, right? There's both of those dynamics, and many others are probably also included. Rick, it looks like you have your hand up. Do you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I've taken an interest in the American Revolution for some years now, and unlike you, it takes me 10 years to get about a year's worth of knowledge. So but all this, even what 100+ years later, plays directly into the revolution and the causes of it. And even if during the Civil War, it was the Yankees, it was the New Englanders who were descendants of the Puritans who pushed for abolition. And it's the whole history is fascinating, and it's much simplified in school, understandably, but
right, yeah,
totally. But interesting stuff. So I'll shut up now. But
no, I appreciate that comment. And excuse me, I will say I've been working on this, and I myself have become like more and more fascinated. I'm like, well, maybe we need to have a 20-week class, but we're not going to do that, I promise. But there's so much detail and so many interesting little pieces, and so many ways that those little pieces actually do illuminate us. Like it helps you understand your own history, the history of the country that you're in, for better and worse. I mean, both of those are at play. And so so my challenge now as we move in, like we've gone three sessions, and I've got us 50 years. I got to speed things up a little bit. So I'm hoping next couple of weeks, then we'll make some leaps, and at least maybe midway or so we'll be somewhere in the 19th century, because that is also a place where some really interesting things happened in congregational circles. Any concluding comments or questions?
Christian, just one of the thoughts was, as you've got the unity of the church, but as they try and define their doctrine more and more, they just fracture up. And that's true across up to today, even more so,
Right. Yeah. If we could like, if we put it in a Protestant frame, you have Luther, who argues back to the sources. Like he picks up that Renaissance mantra and he says, ad fontes, back to the sources. Let's go back to the Bible, back to the Hebrew and the Greek. Let's go back to reading the church fathers. He wants to basically skip over the medieval, because he feels like that was the problem. And he believes that if we go back to those sources, that we will, he has an assumption that we will find the truth, and that for him, the truth will be singular. That is, there will be one interpretation, right? But what happens is we know now because we live with it, that you can have many different interpretations of Scripture. And so the initial factor of that creates a serious crisis, because you no longer have a kind of Supreme Court who can make a decision about which one is right, or which two or three can be right. And by Supreme Court, I mean you no longer have a papal office, right? So that's why you have a proliferation of Protestantisms. And I think it's fair to say that this is one of the elements of our tradition, is the freedom to be wrong, about stuff, the freedom to disagree. And thankfully, we live now in a time where that doesn't require bloodshed. But that was not the case, certainly in the early part of the Reformation, and probably created a number of crises that some of which we've actually hit on here.
I always like the joke about the new arrival in heaven, and he's being shown around by St. Peter, and says, "Oh, we got to be very quiet around here. They think they're the only ones up here."
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, with that, Tom, I'm going to end us. I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, and all of you for staying. And let me just say a quick word, and then we'll see you all later. Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to go back and to try and understand with empathy, but also with some level of care, the ways in which the motives that drove people to do what they did, and in particular to help us to understand the deep dynamics that shape us and our church as we try to figure out what does it mean for us to be us, in the way that you want us to be us in the place that we've been called. We ask and pray, Lord, and I ask and pray that whatever is of use that we take away, and whatever is not, we leave here. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, blessings, everyone. Thank you.